The photograph was still on my phone when I found out. I hadn't deleted it, I don't know why. It was a good photo. She was standing at the departure gate, her carry-on behind her, our two kids flanking her like bookends, and she was smiling at the camera, at me, with the full warmth of someone completely at ease. The kind of smile you don't perform. The kind that reaches the eyes without effort. Our son had his arm around her waist. Our daughter was mid-laugh at something just out of frame. It looked, as a photograph, like a family. I had taken that picture. I had stood on the departure side of the security line and taken it, and then I had kissed her goodbye and told her to have a wonderful week and to send me photos of the beach, and she had said she would, and she had walked through the gate, and I had watched the back of her head until it disappeared. That was a Thursday in July. My name is Marcus. I was 41 that summer. I worked as a civil engineer for a mid-sized infrastructure firm, the kind of work that involves long stretches of careful detail followed by longer stretches of waiting for other people to make decisions. I was good at it. I was also, that particular July, in the middle of a deadline that had been moved 3 times and could not be moved again, which was why I wasn't on the flight. The trip had been Renata's idea. A week on the Adriatic coast with our children, Leo, who was 12, and Sophie, who was 9. A proper summer holiday, the kind we had been meaning to take for 2 years and kept deferring. She had organized everything, the flights, the apartment rental, the itinerary. I had felt guilty about the deadline. She had been gracious about it, almost, I remember thinking at the time, surprisingly gracious. She said it was fine. She said she and the kids would have a wonderful time and I could join them for the last 2 days if the work cleared in time. It didn't clear in time. I called every evening. The calls were warm, full of detail. Sophie had found a starfish, Leo had burned his shoulders, the apartment had a lemon tree in the courtyard. She sounded happy. She sounded the way someone sounds when a holiday is working exactly as it should. On the 6th day, Leo called me from his own phone, which he did occasionally when he wanted to talk without the call being organized by an adult. He was telling me about a boat trip they'd taken that afternoon, enthusiastic and slightly sunburned in his descriptions, and somewhere in the middle of it he mentioned, the way 12-year-olds mention things that carry more weight than they know, casually, parenthetically, already moving on, that mom's friend had come on the boat too. Which friend? I asked. The one from the beach, he said. Daniel. I didn't say anything for a moment. Who's Daniel? I asked. I don't know, Leo said, losing interest already. Just a guy she knows. He's been around a few times. He taught me to play backgammon. He's pretty cool actually. A few times. I ended the call normally. I told Leo the first loved him. I put the phone face down on the desk and sat very still and looked at the half-finished engineering drawings on my screen and thought about a man named Daniel who had been around a few times, who had taught my son to play backgammon, who had come on a boat trip with my family on a holiday I hadn't been able to attend. The photograph was still in my pocket. Renata at the gate. Full smile. Eyes clear. I opened it and looked at it for a long time. We had been married for 14 years. We had met at a work conference in our late 20s, she was in marketing, I was presenting a project, and she had asked a question afterward that was sharp enough that I sought her out at the evening reception and we talked for 3 hours without noticing. That story had always been ours, the sharp question, the 3 hours, the sensation of time disappearing. We had told it at dinner parties and to our children and at our 10th anniversary in front of family, and every time it had felt true in a way that the best stories do, not exaggerated, just clarified by retelling. The marriage was not perfect. 14 years is long enough for most of the architecture to show its stress points. We had gone through a difficult period 5 years earlier when my mother was ill and I had been largely absent, physically present but emotionally somewhere else, for almost a year. Renata had handled it with patience that I had not sufficiently acknowledged at the time and had been trying, in the years since, to make up for in the small accumulated ways that become the texture of daily life. More presence. More attention. The deliberate noticing of the things she did that I had stopped noticing. I thought we were in a good period. That is the sentence I keep returning to. I genuinely thought we were doing well. The signs, in retrospect, had been arriving since spring. I had read none of them as signs. In April, Renata began going out more in the evenings, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded explanation, but more often than before. A friend's birthday. A gallery opening. A colleague's leaving drinks. She had always had an active social life, this seemed like an extension of something normal. She came home from these evenings with a particular kind of animation, not drunk, not disheveled, but lit up in a way that reminded me of early years, the version of her that was in perpetual motion, running on social energy and the pleasure of being out in the world. I had found it attractive. I had said so. She had laughed and kissed me and said something about how nice it was to feel herself again. I had taken that as a good sign. The phone changes had been gradual enough that I hadn't noticed them accumulating. She switched to a longer passcode in March. I knew this because she unlocked it in front of me once and I noticed more taps than I expected. She said the banking app had required it. A reasonable explanation. In May, she had begun leaving the room when certain calls came in, not abruptly but with a smooth naturalness that suggested the habit was already established. I had a vague memory of noticing once that she'd turned the phone screen down on the kitchen counter and then, when I tried to reference it later, couldn't quite place the memory with certainty. There was one specific evening in June, 3 weeks before the trip, that I have since reconstructed in some detail. We had been watching a film together, one of those quiet domestic evenings that feel like the substance of a long marriage, and her phone had lit up on the coffee table. She'd leaned forward to turn it over, just a slight motion, and then returned her attention to the screen. I had noticed it at the time and immediately filed it as nothing. Someone texting late. A notification. The filing as nothing was a reflex I had trained without knowing I was training it. When Renata first proposed the trip, she had mentioned a few times that the apartment complex had a social atmosphere, a pool, shared spaces, the kind of setup where you inevitably met other guests. She had seemed almost enthusiastic about this aspect, the accidental sociability of a place designed for it. I had thought this was typical Renata, who was genuinely extroverted in a way I sometimes envied. Of course, she would be pleased about an environment that made conversation easy. I had not thought about it again. The trip logistics had been entirely hers. She had handled the booking, the packing lists, the children's activity planning, with an efficiency and investment that I had attributed to her relief at finally making the holiday happen. She had stayed up late 2 nights running in the week before departure, working on her laptop, which she said was a combination of work prep and holiday research. I had brought her tea. I had been grateful for her competence. Now I wondered what else she had been arranging in those late hours. And now I had the name Daniel, offered by my 12-year-old son with the breezy innocence of a child who sees what he sees without yet knowing what to do with it. I did not call Renata that night. I needed time with what I knew, or what I suspected, before I gave her the opportunity to respond to it. This was not strategic in the way of a man preparing an ambush. It was the reflex of someone who needed to understand the shape of the thing before they were asked to react to it. I called Leo the following afternoon, keeping my voice light, the way you do when you are asking questions you cannot afford to seem too interested in. I asked about the boat trip, let him describe it in the detail 12-year-olds use when something has genuinely engaged them. Then, casually, tell me more about the backgammon guy. Daniel, was it? Yeah, Daniel, Leo said. He's staying at the same complex, I think. He has a really nice camera, like a proper one, not a phone. He showed me how the lens works. Did Mum know him before the trip? A pause. The particular pause of a child who has picked up on something in the question without being able to name it. I don't know, he said. She seemed to know him already. Like when you know someone, you know. Not meeting them for the first time. I thanked him. I told him the boat trip sounded great. I said I'd see him in a couple of days. After I hung up, I sat in my study and let myself, for the first time, seriously consider the possibility. The trip organized entirely by Renata. The specific apartment complex chosen, with its social atmosphere. The evenings out since spring, the animation she'd come home with, the phrase feeling like herself again. The phone turned face down. The late laptop hours. And now Daniel, a man with a good camera and a set of backgammon skills who had been around a few times and whom my son correctly identified as someone she already knew. I was not a man given to spiraling. It was not my nature. I had always operated by a kind of methodical steadiness that served me well professionally and which Renata had occasionally, gently, found frustrating emotionally. She had told me more than once that she sometimes couldn't tell what I was feeling because my surface was so consistent. I was feeling something now, sitting in the study, that was not consistent at all. It was a low, cold, structural wrongness, like discovering a crack in a load-bearing wall. I thought about calling her. I thought about what she would say, something warm and explanatory, the name Daniel absorbed into a harmless context, the whole thing resolved in 5 minutes of plausible reassurance. And I thought, I will not be able to tell if she is lying to me. Not on a phone call. Not like this. Instead, I called a colleague of mine, a man named Pyotr who had done a renovation at an apartment complex on the same stretch of coast the previous summer and who I knew had contacts in the area. I asked, in a way that revealed nothing, whether he knew anyone who might be able to check who was registered as a guest at a specific property during a specific week. Pyotr, who was a perceptive man, said, "Is everything all right, Marcus?" "I'm not sure," I said. "That's what I'm trying to find out." He gave me a number. He said the person would be discreet. He didn't ask anything else. Meanwhile, Renata called me that evening. The call was warm, detailed, completely normal. Sophie's starfish had been released back to the sea with appropriate ceremony. Leo had asked if they could come back next summer. She told me she missed me. She said the apartment was beautiful and the weather was perfect and she wished I was there. I said all the right things back. My voice didn't change. The steadiness Renata had sometimes found frustrating was, in that moment, the most useful thing I possessed. After she hung up, I noticed that she had not mentioned Daniel. Not once. Not a stray reference, not a casual social detail of the kind she would normally have offered freely. We met a couple interesting people at the pool, nothing. The absence of the name, in a call full of holiday details, was more informative than its presence would have been. The contact Pyotr had given me confirmed, 2 days later, that a single male guest named Daniel had been registered at the same complex since the first day of Renata's booking. Not arriving after, registered for the same dates. The same arrival day. The booking had been made 6 weeks earlier. I sat with that information for 12 hours before I decided what to do with it. 12 hours is a long time to sit with something. Long enough to move through the initial cold shock and arrive somewhere more functional. Long enough to understand that how I handled the next phase would determine not just what I knew but what I could prove, and not just what I could prove but how the weeks and months after would be shaped. I had 2 children on a beach with their mother. I had a flight home in 2 days. I had a marriage of 14 years and a man named Daniel who had been booked into the same complex on the same dates, 6 weeks in advance, and who had spent enough time with my family that my son considered him worth mentioning and my wife had considered him worth concealing. I called Pyotr back. He gave me, this time, a name, a professional, he said, reliable and thorough. The professional's name was Bernard. I called Bernard that evening and had a conversation I had never expected to have in my life, in the same calm voice I used to discuss engineering specifications, laying out what I knew and what I needed. Bernard asked 2 questions and then said he could work with what I had. The following 24 hours produced 3 things. The first was a series of photographs, Renata and a man, dark-haired, 40-ish, the kind of tan that speaks to a week in the sun, at a waterfront restaurant 2 evenings earlier. Sitting close. Her hand visible on the table, near his. An expression on her face I recognized from years ago and had not seen recently. Not happiness exactly, ease. The same ease I had found in the photograph at the gate, but directed at someone else entirely. The second was confirmation that Daniel was not someone she had met on the trip. Bernard had worked quickly, Daniel was a photographer, the good camera Leo had admired was professional equipment, and he had been connected to Renata on social media for at least 8 months. Their public interaction was sparse, careful, the digital behavior of people who know they're visible. But he was not a stranger who had become a friend. He was someone she had known before she packed the suitcases. The third thing was the one I hadn't expected. Bernard found, through channels I didn't ask him to specify, a message exchange, not the full thread, just fragments, between Renata and a mutual friend of ours named Petra. The fragments were from a week before the trip. In one of them, Renata said, "He's going to be there the whole week. The kids will be a buffer but we'll have evenings." I read that sentence several times. The kids will be a buffer. Leo and Sophie, 9 and 12, on their summer holiday, not knowing. Serving, without their knowledge, as social cover for their mother's other life. That sentence did more damage than anything else I had found. More than the photographs, more than the booking confirmation, more than the 8 months of prior connection. Because everything else was about Renata and what she had chosen. This was about my children, who had chosen nothing. I called my sister that evening and asked if she could take the week after the trip, just to have them around, just for normality. She said of course, she'd been wanting to see them anyway. She didn't ask why. I told her I would explain later. Then I waited for them to come home. Renata arrived back on a Saturday afternoon. The children were sunburned and tired and immediately distributed themselves around the house with the particular boneless relief of children returning to their own rooms after a week in someone else's space. Renata moved through the kitchen efficiently, unpacking bags, starting a load of laundry, asking about the deadline. She was warm. She looked slightly sad in the specific way of someone returning from a place they would rather still be. She kissed me on the cheek when she came in. I let her. I waited until Sunday evening. I waited because I needed the children to be elsewhere, my sister had taken them for the afternoon and would keep them through dinner, and because I needed to be completely steady. I had been steady for a week. I could be steady for one more conversation. Renata was in the kitchen, making tea, her back to me, when I put the photographs on the counter. Not all of them. 3. The waterfront restaurant. His hand near hers. Her expression. I didn't say anything. I just set them down in a row and took a step back. She turned from the kettle and saw them. I watched the moment of comprehension move across her face, not shock exactly, more the recognition of an outcome she had been, on some level, preparing for. Her expression didn't collapse into guilt. It went very still. The stillness of someone who had already, somewhere, rehearsed this. How long? I asked. She looked at the photographs for a moment longer. Then she set the kettle down and turned to face me properly. 8 months, she said. 8 months. The social media connection had been right. 8 months of evenings out, of animation when she came home, of phone screens turned face down. 8 months of the phrase feeling like herself again, and the self she had been feeling like was one that included a man named Daniel. You brought him on our family holiday, I said. He was all ready, she started. He was booked on the same dates, I said. 6 weeks in advance. While you were booking the flights. While you were making packing lists and researching restaurants. He was already arranged. I paused. Our kids were there. That landed. I watched it land. For the first time in the conversation her composure slipped, not into open distress but into something harder to look at. A kind of recognition. The particular expression of someone seeing their own actions reflected without the softening of their own internal justification. I didn't, she started, and then stopped. You used them, I said. Not deliberately, maybe. But Leo told me Daniel had been around a few times. He taught him backgammon. He thought he was cool. I kept my voice level with effort. Our 12-year-old was building a relationship with the man his mother was sleeping with, on a holiday designed around giving you access to him. And he had no idea. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a kitchen completely. Renata sat down at the table. She put her hands flat on the surface in front of her. When she spoke again, her voice was different, lower, stripped of the careful composure. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said. "What was it supposed to be like?" She didn't answer that. And in the not answering I understood that there had been no plan beyond the wanting, no thought through consequence, no considered exit, just the momentum of something that had felt, in the middle of it, like the only real thing. "Do you love him?" I asked. A long pause. "I don't know," she said. Which was, in its honesty, the most devastating answer available. "Did you love me?" I asked. "In the last 8 months?" "Yes," she said. And that too, somehow, was devastating, because it meant this was not the story of a woman who had fallen out of love and made a decision. It was the story of something more complicated and less resolved than that, and complicated and unresolved are harder to live with than clean. I told her I needed her to leave for a few days. I told her I needed to be able to talk to the children from a position of steadiness, which I could not do while navigating what I was currently feeling. I told her that what happened after that we would need to decide carefully, and slowly, because there were 2 children who deserved parents who handled this like adult. She nodded. She packed a bag. She called her sister. At the door, she stopped. She didn't turn around. "I'm sorry about the trip," she said. "I'm sorry about using them. I know that's the part that, I know." I didn't say anything. The door closed. The house was very quiet. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, in the same chair she had been sitting in, and looked at the 3 photographs still on the counter. Then I got up and turned them face down and went to call my children and tell them I would pick them up in the morning. The weeks after are the part of these stories that rarely gets told in full, because they are less dramatic than the revelation and more grueling than anything that came before it. There were lawyers. There were conversations about the children's schedules that took place in a register of exhausted practicality that felt nothing like 14 years of marriage and everything like the dismantling of one. There were sessions with a mediator, because we had agreed, Renata and I, separately and then together, that whatever we had done or not done to each other, Leo and Sophie had not done anything, and they deserved parents who could be in the same room without the room becoming a weather system. Leo was 12 and therefore knew more than we wanted him to. He had understood, from the days following their return and my careful conversations with him, that something had happened involving Daniel, and that Daniel was the reason things were different now. He didn't ask direct questions. He processed it the way 12-year-olds process things, internally, obliquely, in sudden sidelong references that told you more than direct interrogation would have. He was angry in ways that surfaced unexpectedly. Once, washing up, he said without looking at me, "I don't want to play backgammon again," and I said that was fine, and we didn't discuss it further. Sophie was 9 and was given a simpler version of the truth, in smaller pieces, across a longer period. She was told that Mom and Dad were going to live differently but that nothing about how much they loved her had changed. She accepted this with the pragmatic adaptability of a 9-year-old who trusts the adults in her life to be competent, which was both a gift and a responsibility I felt daily. Renata and I did not reconcile. I want to be clear about this without framing it as a clean decision, because it wasn't. There were 2 conversations in the months following the initial separation where the possibility of a different path was briefly available, where she had clearly thought about it and I had clearly thought about it and we sat across from each other in that specific suspended way and then both, separately, arrived at the same conclusion, that what had been damaged was not the marriage exactly, not the 14 years or the story of the conference or the children. What had been damaged was simpler and harder to repair. It was the basic belief that the person across from me was being straight with me. That the life we were in was the life she was actually living. That belief, once gone, turned out not to be replaceable by effort. Daniel, I eventually learned, had not continued beyond that autumn. Renata mentioned it once, quietly, without request, almost as information she felt I was owed. I accepted it the way you accept information that changes nothing material about your current reality. What I found myself thinking about, in the months of rearrangement, was the photograph at the gate. Not obsessively. But I would return to it sometimes, in the way you return to a thing that doesn't resolve. She had been smiling at me, genuinely, I still believed, and walking towards something else entirely. Both things had been true at the same moment. And I could not find the lie in the smile, because I didn't think it had been a lie. I thought she had loved me and done this anyway, which is a more uncomfortable truth than simple deception would have been. The photograph is still on my phone. I don't know why I haven't deleted it. Maybe because it is also a photograph of my children, Leo with his arm around her waist, Sophie mid-laugh. Maybe because it contains people and a moment that were real, whatever else was happening inside the same frame. Leo is 14 now. He has become quieter than he was, more watchful, in ways I monitor carefully and mostly trust. Last summer he asked me, out of nowhere, whether I was ever going to be with someone else. I said I didn't know, maybe someday. He said, with the directness of an adolescent who has run out of patience for adult complexity, you should. You're not that old. I laughed for the first time in what felt like a while. I don't know what the future holds, not with any confidence, not in the particular area of the question Leo was asking. What I know is smaller and more reliable, that I am present for my children in a way I intend to continue, that the work is still there and still demanding and still the scaffolding of a life, and that the particular kind of grief involved in realizing a long relationship contained a life you didn't know about is a finite thing. Not fast. But finite. The Adriatic is somewhere I will probably not go back to for a long time. The lemon tree in the courtyard, which Renata had mentioned with pleasure in one of those evening calls, I find myself thinking of sometimes. I never saw it. It exists in the story entirely at her description, and at some point, I realized that is a small, accurate metaphor for a great deal of what I now understand about those 2 weeks. I was always hearing about it. I was never there. Marcus's story is built on a specific and painful irony. The evidence of betrayal was hidden inside the ordinary rhythms of a life he trusted. Every sign that now reads clearly, the phone habits, the evenings out, the holiday organized with unusual investment, was individually explainable, and it was that explainability that made the whole construction so durable. This is the psychology of gradual erosion. Deception doesn't announce itself. It accumulates quietly in the spaces where trust lives. The central mistake Marcus made was not naivety, it was the specific blindness of a man who had decided, after the difficult period of his mother's illness, to be more present and more trusting. His deliberate noticing, his conscious effort to appreciate Renata, had inadvertently lowered his critical sensitivity. He had turned toward the marriage and in doing so had oriented himself away from its warning signals. This is the painful paradox of repair, the effort to be better can make you worse at seeing clearly. Renata's behavior reveals a particular kind of internal compartmentalization, the ability to hold two emotional realities simultaneously without allowing them to contaminate each other. She genuinely loved Marcus, by her own admission. She organized a holiday with real attention to her children's enjoyment. And she arranged access to Daniel with equal care. These are not contradictions in her experience, they are parallel tracks that she managed not to let intersect, until they did. The tragedy is that this compartmentalization is not unusual. Many betrayals are not the product of a person who has stopped loving. They are the product of someone who has refused to choose. The most morally significant moment in the story is the fragment of the message to Petra, "The kids will be a buffer." This is the sentence that separates carelessness from something harder to excuse. Marcus could have processed the affair, however painfully, as a private matter between two adults. But the children's presence on that trip, their innocence, their attachment to a man they didn't know they were being used to provide cover for, transformed the betrayal into something that reached beyond the marriage. Leo building a genuine connection with Daniel, Sophie on the boat trip, both of them participants in a scene whose real architecture they couldn't see, this is the damage that Marcus can't assign to time and distance the way he can assign the rest. At what point would you have confronted her? When Leo mentioned Daniel, or only after the photographs confirmed it? The answer says a great deal about how much discomfort we're willing to hold before we let ourselves see clearly. Marcus's response, methodical, private, gathering information before speaking, is entirely consistent with his character and entirely effective. He didn't confront Renata from emotion. He waited until he had a complete picture, which meant that when the confrontation came, she had no room for reframing. The photographs were specific. The booking dates were specific. The message fragment was specific. She could not offer him an alternative explanation because he had already removed the space where alternative explanations live. The lesson this surface is one worth holding: knowing your own patterns matters in a crisis. Marcus's steadiness, which Renata had sometimes found emotionally frustrating, was the quality that protected him when it counted. Not because steadiness is always the right response to emotional pain, but because it gave him the time and clarity to act from understanding rather than reaction. Looking at the full arc of this story, what emerges most clearly is the theme of parallel lives, not as metaphor, but as a structural reality that went undetected for 8 months because the external life was so well maintained. Renata never stopped performing the role of wife and mother. She organized, she was present, she expressed love. And this is precisely what makes her behavior psychologically distinct from simple abandonment. She had not left the marriage emotionally in any visible way. She had added something to it without removing anything, and she had sustained that addition with enough organizational intelligence that it remained invisible until a 12-year-old mentioned a name in a phone call. The self-deception at work here is sophisticated. Renata had almost certainly constructed an internal narrative in which the affair was a separate category, something that existed in its own space and did not contaminate the real life she was living with her family. This kind of compartmentalization depends on never fully examining the intersection points. The trip forced an intersection she had planned carefully but could not ultimately control, because children are honest in ways adults have forgotten how to be. The point of no return was not the confrontation or even the discovery. It was the message to Petra. The moment Renata wrote "the kids will be a buffer," she crossed from someone caught in a complicated emotional situation to someone who had made a calculation involving her children. That calculation could not be unmade. And Marcus, when he read it, understood something that no reconciliation conversation could reach, that the person he thought he knew had been capable, in a specific moment, of reducing their children to functional objects in someone else's story. That knowledge fundamentally altered his understanding of who he had been married to. What Marcus carries forward is not bitterness, the story's final tone resists that, but a clearer, more honest picture of the life he was actually living, which is, in its way, a harder gift than the easier version would have been. The photograph at the gate stays with me too. The real smile, the real children, the real love, and the other thing, existing inside the same frame. That is what I find most difficult about this story. Not the deception, but the fact that the love wasn't fake. It just wasn't enough to stop what happened. Maybe that's the thing we find hardest to accept, that someone can love you genuinely and still choose something that destroys what you had. There's no villain in that version of the story. Just a person who wanted too much and protected too little of what mattered most.